at FUF. We have heard so much about. I mean, the world is a very complicated place. A lot of things happen, and what we read and what we talk about all the time is how Europe is affected by all the changes. And so far, actually in Stockholm, in spite of all the seminars, all the discussions, there haven't been one single meeting, seminar, or discussion on how Africa is affected by what is happening. And now we have this fantastic opportunity to have Professor Fantu Cheru here. No one could tell us better and more about what is happening. So with this very short introduction, I ask Fantu to start, and what he will do is he will talk for quite some time. Then perhaps I will fill up with some questions, and then we will have some time for questions from the floor. So, Fantu, it's very nice to have you here. Just one more thing. These are not here for you. They are we are streaming, which means that later on when you ask questions on, you have to talk into this. So Fantu and I myself, we have to talk loudly so you can hear it anyway. Please, Fantu.
Thank you. I don't need that microphone.
No.
Okay. I already have one. Okay. Thank you for coming. Leonard and I meet at least once a month and spend an hour over lunch about taking a scorecard of where the world is going. And we leave completely depressed, and we meet the next time. Finally decided, this is too much to carry for two individuals. Why can't we have a much larger group for what I call not a seminar, but more a group therapy session? So what you will have, in a sense, is a group therapy session. This is, we're living quite incredible historical period that we live right now. Even for somebody who is a political animal like myself, it's absolutely too much to take in. The complexities, the changes that are taking around the world, what it means to each of us as citizens is much larger than one can elaborate. The best I think one can characterize is, any of you have read Karl Polanyi's book on the Great Transformation, what he calls the double movement. We are living in a period of what I call the double movement. The most illustrative moment for me this year has been the inaugural address of the US president, which was completely a very different narrative of the world, different strategies, how to move the United States, a more isolationist agenda. And 2 days later, I was watching the World Economic Forum in Davos, and a brilliant speech that was given by the Chinese President Xi Jinping, a speech I'm absolutely clear written by a good friend of mine, Justin Lin, a brilliant embrace of integration, globalization, internationalism, two different narratives within a time span of 36 hours. So that's where we are. It's this complex world, and we don't know where we're going. For me, at least, as many of us are still shell-shocked from the outcome of the November elections, and everyone is concerned. Where are we heading? What's going to happen? And of course, as an African, what does it mean for Africa? So the conditions are quite more frightening, as you've seen. I don't know what the elections tomorrow in the Netherlands, to be followed by the French elections. So we are really living in a rather turbulent environment in the global system. And then I'll share with you later on. This morning, the Foreign Affairs magazine broke the news, a proposal that the president will send to Congress Thursday morning, the new budget allocation with regard to significant changes, reductions in the overall United Nations support, over by 50% cut in the UN system. So the whole idea of multilateralism, internationalism, multiculturalism, all these issues are basically the entire, post-war order is basically being thrown out of the windows. So what does it mean to the world? So in a sense, we live in a very uncertain world. But the election really of the Donald Trump to the presidency came against the backdrop, when you look into Africa, against the backdrop of key reversals or retreats, I call, in Africa's economic fortune. 3, 4, 5 years ago, the rise of Africa, the narrative was this positive narrative. All of a sudden, the last 2 years, 3 years, we have also begun to see significant reversal in many fronts. The retreat, particularly in democracy, and the whole epidemic of term limit, getting rid of term limit. So we're beginning to see the erosion. We have some triumphs in Burkina Faso, we have triumphs in Gambia more recently, but those are the exception. In many countries, the doors are being closed for civil society organization. The space is being narrowed down. So the retreat to democracy is happening. So in a sense, attribution of what would happen to Africa before you can get into what is going likely to happen under the new US presidency, one has to take this into background. There's been a decline in economic performance, fragility of the African economy, driven by commodities. All those are beginning also to unravel over the last 2-3 years. There have been internal growing inequalities, despite the fact there has been tremendous economic growth. Slowdown also even both in the Chinese and the emerging economies, what is also directly happening. So you have to have that on the background before you can begin to engage what is more likely to happen in the future in the economy. So when I look into these global changes, would have direct impact on the trajectories of Africa's development in general, both politically and economically. But more so, really, the specific changes that are taking place in the United States are more likely even to do more harm. You have already seen about, 2 months ago when the administration put a gag order, not even actual cut, a gag order on the financing of a health program, which prompted both the Dutch Minister of Development Cooperation or your own Minister of Development Cooperation to set up that pledging conference in Brussels about 2 weeks ago. That was even before the actual cut take place. Today I'll talk about later what the significance of the cut is going to be, by how much. So it is very difficult at this point to see to predict what the administration's policy towards Africa, toward developing countries in general, is going to be. The possibility of an abrupt shift in US-Africa policy was raised particularly in December by a piece that the New York Times did, which really shows an overall skepticism. There was 4-page questions that the transition team raised. Let me just talk about 2 of those questions. They said, with so much corruption in Africa, how much of our funding is stolen? Shows you the naivety of the administration. Why should we spend much of this fund when we are suffering here at home? So already there was skepticism about the incoming administration in terms of their long-term relationship with Africa. So this whole isolationist tendency, the America first narrative on the administration, would definitely have an impact on the future of US-Africa relationship. So on one hand, you will see increasing isolationism. On the other hand, you would also, I would expect, we will see selective adventurism. This adventurism in terms of similar to the kind of unplanned intervention that we saw a day after inauguration in Yemen. Those are more likely to happen in at least 4 selected zones of conflict in Africa, which I'll come back in a few minutes. But the idea of make America great again is not simply a slogan. They mean it. They really mean it. So one should not literally write it off as being a slogan. There is tendencies of, the idea of isolationism, a rejection of multiculturalism, rejection of internationalism is very much embedded. And I will talk about it, how this is more going to be manifest itself in the way the policies are taking place. So what are the things we need to be watching? What are the signals we should be looking for over the next months, over the next 6 month period of time? Today, the president has called only 4 African leaders. The Sisi, which is the Egyptian dictator, and they have called Uhuru Kenyatta last week. We've called the Nigerian president and Jacob Zuma. So he has been in touch so far with 4 African presidents for an obvious reason, which I'll come back. Most of it really have to do on the security dimension. But what are the things that we need to look into right now in terms of the Africa policy? The first is really, as you know, the president have completely revamped the National Security Council. Within the National Security Council, the most important position on Africa will be the Africa Director on the National Security Council. So to the extent already they have difficulty putting together the National Security Council, the first one got fired. The second one reluctantly brought from the Navy. He's more likely a scholar, not just any regular politician. And I would estimate he'll have more difficulty. So this National Security Advisor plays a very central role, more than the Secretary of State. Plays a very central role. Leadership for coordinating Africa-related policy, interagency coordination, ensure a clear and coherent policy comes out of the administration. That means the person who is the Africa Director at the National Security Council needs to know the region very well. You need to have very strong background in Africa, in African policy. And that they are stuck right now. They don't know whom they want to bring. There's possibly one person, I will come back, but they will never be able to get him because he is too liberal, he's not the kind of conservative that they want. So right now, before Mike Flynn was fired, he has identified a guy called Robert Townley, who was a former Marine intelligence officer, to be the Africa Director at the National Security Council. The problem that they had was that the CIA will not give him what he called elite clearance, security clearance. So he was out of the question right now. So there's a major chaos, disorganization within the administration. So the first, as I said, who is going to be the Africa Director at the National Security Council? That's going to be a very important position. Somebody who is knowledgeable about Africa, the direction in which Africa is going to. The second area of problem will be the State Department. Here, the finding the right candidate to become the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa is also becoming a big problem for them. Africa, in general, Africa-related posts is going to be a lot of vacancies. Across departments, the Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture, the State Department, the Treasury Department, they always have Africa positions. All of these are not filled right now. None. On top of that, key individuals, key people who have been career civil servants in the State Department, most of them, about 16 of them left immediately. So the huge challenge. So the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who used to be the president of ExxonMobil, has very little knowledge about Africa except through the lens of ExxonMobil. He really doesn't know anything, anybody else about. But he has one person he can bring along with him. And that is basically somebody who served as the Africa Director of the National Security Council under Bush 1. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Africa under Bush 2. And this person basically is the Africa Director at ExxonMobil itself. So it's a big difficulty. How can you bring your own man out of ExxonMobil back to the State Department? Second, he was more liberal. So it's a very, very difficult situation. The third, of course, you have to deal is, but if the Secretary of State really chooses a good Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, then there is a very good hope that Africa's policy would probably get the attention it requires with the administration. So it's really key here is that to what extent the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa is going to be available. But the question is who is winning and what are the lineup of forces right now in Washington? There's one academic in terms of that are mentioned who is now basically at the Atlantic Council. He's the Africa Director, Atlantic Council. I've done much of it. I've seen a lot of his writing. Peter Pham, he is basically a security specialist. He's in the running, but whether that will happen remain to be seen. The second is a woman who worked, Kate Holmquist, who is basically the director for the strategic studies for the International Defense University. So these are the candidates that we have in terms of the potential for the position of the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. But there are also many other appointment positions that are not simply filled right now at this point, and will be very difficult to fill. This will basically involve the MCC, the Million Challenge Corporation, which is similar to the USAID. PEPFAR, which is the President's Initiative Emergency Plan for HIV/AIDS, which George Bush created. If you can just say MCC, a PEPFAR, would be a major success. Again, I think they are very much going to be affected by the budget cut. The third, most critically, have been the USAID. USAID under the State Department. There is one particular person that is mentioned right now, who is the current president of the Republican International Institute. So the point I'm making is a lot of Africa-related positions are not filled, will take a longer period of time to fill. That means it will be a long period of time before you can see a coherent Africa policy on the part of the administration. The USAID position is very critical. The third element would be what you call a very small agency called the Africa Development Foundation, which basically deals with U.S. support to grassroots organization. There again, we have no idea what's going to happen. So in a sense, priority has not been given, not only just for Africa, in general foreign policy, because domestic priorities are really the ones that are given more issues at the present moment. So what would be the impact down the line? What are the critical areas we will see an impact on Africa? The first would be on trade restrictions and on the preferential treatment for Africa, is what he calls AGOA, which is a special programs. It will be negotiated in 2025. Review probably will not start until the end of the first term of the Trump administration. My guess is if there is a second term of the Trump administration, AGOA probably will be gone. Given the attitude of the administration to trade, whether it is the TPP, whether it is the attempt to renegotiate the NAFTA with Mexico and Canada, the general attitude is much more protectionist, more isolationist. So this preferential treatment given to Africa under the AGOA provision are more likely not to survive if there is going to be a second Trump phase. But that will be about 2025. But again, by 2020, the negotiation process will begin. So the very fact, his anti-trade rhetoric would definitely have an impact on the removal of preferential treatment. overall, you're talking about $12 billion. Total US-Africa trade is $12 billion, which is basically one project for the Chinese in Ethiopia. Relatively, when you look into how much Chinese trade with Africa has gone up relatively in the last 10 years. So in a sense, the trade restrictions would be, many of the AGOA provisions would be questioned in terms of the administration. So it will be an impact on trade in general. The second will be on the foreign aid issues with regard to the reduction of aid programs. Here again, there are about, for me as far as I'm concerned about 4 areas of the aid program. One is what he calls the Obama era initiative, the Food for Peace, Food for the Future program, the climate change related issues, support for family planning, the Global Public Health Program. So the Global Public Health Program has about 2.8 billion support that is given. That's more likely going to be significantly cut. I'll come back to talk about. The progress toward hunger, that would about 978 million, which support the Feed for the Future program. Here again, at a time particularly where drought is ravaging many parts of Eastern, Southern Africa and Northern Nigeria, some of these programs are going to be very heavily affected, would have a direct impact. Climate change, definitely, that's going to be a big hit is going to see. I'm not quite sure whether the outgoing administration, President Obama, realized that this was going to happen. I mean, the final week, he appropriated $500 million to our climate change fund. He knew it's not going to come once the administration come into power. At least that could be a protected to go. So that would be basically about Africa get about $348 million in terms of climate change mitigation program. They are more likely going to be affected. And then about $2.4 billion, for example, the fiscal year 2017, for support for democratic societies. I think projects on democracy, democratic support are going to vanish. They have not yet uttered a word about this administration, about human rights, about democratic promotion. Not anywhere I have seen anything being said by any of the administration officials about human rights promotion and democratic promotion. That's more likely going to be affected very significantly. There is a small program, about 134 million, what you call Power Africa. I have no idea why Sweden put $1 billion into that program. Sweden is a partner into that initiative. That again would also will face. So what I would see is a reduction in aid program, more influence and power to 2 organizations, which would be the Import-Export Bank of the United States, the Exim Bank, and OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. They want to sell American products. They want to give more loan, more credit support rather than aid program. So the journal, you will see more in terms of how to promote American jobs at home, while at the same time also selling programs and goods and services to those places. So you will see a significant shift in the priorities of development assistance in general. So what happened, for example, today in terms of this, what the aid program cut, if I can read it here, 50% U.S. funding to the United Nations program, 50% cut in U.S. funding. That were about 37% cut to the State Department budget. How much? 37% to the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development. So USAID generally get about $22 billion. Out of that $22 billion, $12 billion is what you call real development assistance. The other basically is divided between Egypt and Israel, which is military support program. So the aid budget, when you really bring it down, is really very small. But even that is more likely to happen. So right now, the U.S. spend roughly about $10 billion annually to the UN. And the most affected is going to be peacekeeping operations. Most peacekeeping operations are in Africa. the administration already want to cut $1.2 billion from peacekeeping support to South Sudan. They want to take, that money is going to be taken out immediately. And UNICEF, UN Development Program, UNDP, these are more likely going to be affected. Additional also, that will be to the UN refugee program. The UN refugee programs get about, total budget is about $4 billion. $1.5 billion of that come from the United States. That will be significantly cut. And the World Food Program, that's what we are all waiting to see. Because the budget will come out as a Thursday. We won't have to look into the line item reduction because the World Food Program is separated from the Department of Agriculture, not from the State Department. It's a special allocation. So that would be the UN Refugee Program, the World Food Program, which are very, very important programs, will be heavily scrutinized. Of course, are they bluffing? They are not bluffing. This is real. Because you have to also look into these cuts against mandated cut, $54 billion they will cut from domestic programs in the United States. $54 billion, which would go to the Defense Department. There was a report that was done by the Congressional Budget Office today, this morning. 14 million Americans will be affected by the new program that replaces Obamacare. 14 million people they will lose this coverage as soon as the House and Senate approve that program. So it's really a scorched earth approach at home. So a scorched earth approach in the foreign policy area will be tolerated. So they're more likely going to get their way. So these cuts are more likely going to affect a great deal. So the aid program the third area will be the military assistance. Military assistance, support for anti-terrorism campaign will be highly, highly intensified. That means there will be greater role for AFRICOM, the Africa High Command, which is based in Stuttgart, Germany. So what do I see more likely to happen? One will be 4 theaters of operations support that would happen. The first will be the Horn of Africa. That is Somalia, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Yemen. You have to include Yemen. It's not in Africa, but it is. Kenya, Uganda. The attack on Al-Shabaab and its affiliates. So that is going to be a major area, mostly more likely drone operations, off-sea operation from U.S. naval operations from the Red Sea, rather than the placing of ground troops in the countries. So that would be one area of engagement we will see. And in the Sahel region, which is basically Mali, Mauritania, Algeria, Burkina Faso, that will be Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb. That will be more, counter-insurgency, counter-terrorism operations will be expanded. Again, more expenditure on the military component. In North Africa, certainly they will continue, which is basically Tunisia, Libya, dealing with the question of, ISIS. Nigeria and Central Africa, Cameroon, the Central African Republic will be basically dealing with Boko Haram operations. So we will see increasing military operations, bilateral, not even cooperation with multilateral or UN systems in general, because the general perception of the UN is a useless organization. We're wasting our money. Peace operations have not done anything. And certainly a focus on the Sudans basically. So with that kind of, particularly with increasing interest, interest by China to set up a naval base in Djibouti, we have, in a sense, a very small revival of kind of Cold War kind of skirmishes in that part of the world. So I would say that Trump will be more interventionist to play to the gallery at home. In America is great again. and nobody messes around with us. Some of it will be done really not because they want to do resolution of major conflict at the regional level, more so really to play up to the gallery at home. So there'll be more interventions than the previous administration. The choice for them is going to be small war or big war. So these are what I call small war. The idea of going a major intervention in the Middle East, with a major intervention or confrontation with the Chinese in the South China Sea is unlikely, although certainly they will continue to play back at home. So it is going to be this mixture of a rising America, making America great again. So we will see, we'll get caught up in that situation, the Africa continent. The fourth areas, of course, as I said before, is a major retreat on human rights and democracy support. There's a lot of dictators who are really very happy he is the president right now, because nobody's going to raise these questions. So the rhetoric of counterterrorism, will drown the voices of democracy and human rights. Unfortunately, it's a very bad time. At a time where internally we've been experiencing this retreat on democracy and human rights, the coming of this administration is more likely to amplify those erosions and as much as possible. So it's from that point of view, it's very bad news, because there are not going to be any defense of human rights. Defense of democracy is unlikely to happen. The fifth area, of course, is immigration issues. As a person who built his entire campaign to build a wall against his neighbors, is not going to is expected to take too kindly on the opening of Americans' door to African immigrants or any other immigrant, for that matter. Already the three countries, Somalia, Sudan, Libya, are in the no travel ban list already, and part of the executive order. It matters very little for the administration. If the immigrant is an asylum seeker or trying to escape discrimination, a refugee fleeing for war, or a young person trying to pursue their dreams, they simply are not going to be. The doors are shut. So that open policy that is there is unlikely to happen. Even for Africa, what we call the diversity visa, they have a lottery. Even the diversity visa is expected to be scrapped this year, eventually. And lastly would be as I said, the cut in the UN programs. A lot of UN programs, particularly peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, all are really very much heavily focused on Africa. They're more likely, already we're seeing it, a significant cut is going to happen in those areas, which will affect dramatically the peacekeeping operation. So I think we should expect for the first year, at least until the midterm election, which is about a year and a half, almost 2 years from now, the domestic issues will dominate. So he has to demonstrate some success on the domestic issues in terms of job creation. Of course, he's lying to all these coal miners, the coal is going to be great again, and that's not likely going to happen. I think you will begin to shift around the midterm election, because I'm not quite sure, even with the significant investment they will do, that they will be able to deliver on many of the promises of the election by the midterm election. Would the balance of power both in the Senate and the House will change 2 years from now? Remain to be seen. But certainly they will play to the domestic gallery. Certainly the rhetoric against the Chinese will continue. There will be diversionary tactics as much as possible to keep the momentum going. So in general, I would say the climate for African countries in terms of trade, investment, peace, security, democracy promotion are more likely not to be favorable in many ways. So in a sense, when you take the American part and then you have generally look into the global situation with our uncertain situation, the directions where Europe is heading, and in terms of the European Union and in general, there are consequences, of course, the unknowns with regard to what British politics is going to be, with the triggering of Brexit probably by this week or early next week. So there's a lot of unknowns.
But what will Brexit mean
for Africa? In terms of when you look into, the UK is one of the most, just from the aid part to begin with, there will be a significant probably cut on that, although there is an attempt to create bilateral trade and investment relationship. A lot of things we don't know, really. Mostly the trade dimension and the aid dimension have been very important from the British connection. But again, it's very difficult to predict in terms of how are all these movements going to congeal together, but also what are the positions of African countries. I think governments are not well prepared for many of these things to begin. The great deal of fragilities in the institutions in individual African countries, save a few countries. So remain unprepared to respond to this emerging crisis, which direction the wind is going to blow. So again, this is a very incredible period of time we live in terms of what kind of politics is going to emerge in general, and the consequences of these policies in general. We don't know.
You haven't mentioned at all how others will interact when the United States withdraws. I mean, you have Russia, you have China.
Exactly.
You have the BRICS countries.
Yeah, for the BRICS countries, if you look just the Chinese, Chinese policy is mostly, a 50 plus years long. They see the long horizon. They don't plan on the base of election years. So for them, certainly, it would provide opportunities to consolidate both on investment side, on the trade side, as much as possible. Indians, the most active. Next, Brazil is in a different case because it's been a mess the last 2 years. Turkey has been an important player in Africa. And it's unbelievable. Few people know about the role of Turkey in Africa. And this is really in the last 6 years. It's a major player in development policies, in general, in investment policies. So all the other actors, as you said, also reconfigure their policies and strategies in response to take advantage of it, to deflect the ill effect of the issues. So there are many players in the scene. I'm not quite sure, though, on the Africa side, we are prepared to respond in many ways. Some countries are far ahead, but generally there is not a coherent policy how to deal with the diversity of the factors that are playing a significant role in African development. More, not just on the aid issue, really, increasingly on the trade and investment and knowledge exchange part of it. That's been an important, there has been a shift, the dependence from aid more to something else. But that requires a very different strategy. So you will have countries that are winners and leaders in each of sub-regions' response. But again, the response will be not only towards the United States, towards the EU, toward emerging economies that require different level of expertise, different level of pragmatic policy response on the part of African government.
When you started, you said that there is a downturn in the whole economy of the world, and that investments are going down also from all the parts.
From all parts.
Even from China.
Exactly.
So the question is really, how well can China now and others act and take the place which United States is leaving?
I think they are more likely going to be. You have to see. I've seen a great deal of pragmatism on China part. They have learned lessons. They are getting smarter in the way they do business, based on not altruism, but really more strategically looking into that. Would they feel that position? They already. I mean, part of the reason why a lot of Chinese, Turkish, other investment in Africa has been to take advantage of access to the U.S. market through AGOA. AGOA became the way in which they have been able to have access to the U.S. market. And the Americans, it dawned on them. The real beneficiaries have been really foreign investors who are investing in African countries. But through that, they have been able to have access in leather and textile, particularly the two critical areas where much of the beneficiaries of AGOA has been external investors based in Africa who have been able to use that provision. So what kind of arrangement we will see? We will see different kind of trade arrangements with bilateral donors. The platform is already there to elevate that relationship. China has that, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, there's the India-Africa Summit every year, there's the Turkey-India. So would they elevate this bilateral platform into a more diversified trade arrangement with in African countries remain to be seen. Some discussions is there, particularly on the Turk side. Not to simply meet every 2 years, try to attract investment and aid packages, but a much more formalized bilateral investment and trade relationship. So there might be a multiplicity of trade relationships that are being pushed in the very way, like the withdrawal of the United States from the Trans-Pacific trade arrangement, the collapse of that. The Chinese have been happy to see that because they want to fill that shoes right now. So that kind of thing can possibly happen with regard to each of the major players in this case, both the Asian side and the European side.
AU, African Union,
yeah.
Are they able to take the lead for Africa in new negotiations?
The AU is not in a position to do so. The AU has been good with regard to peacekeeping, the Peace and Security Council of it, but not on this trade investment issues that deals more into a more structural reform of African economies. AU is very much dependent. Almost 75% of peacekeeping operations come from the European Union. It is operational budget is dependent on donors. So it has not yet taken up the capacity to lead on this, which should be positioned to begin with.
Are there also US funding AU?
Limited amount on the peacekeeping side only, but not on trade and investment issues. So there is a lot of sorting out to do on the African side to have the upper hand on the discourse, to lead the discussion, to be more proactive. And the AU has been more a political organization rather than an organization that is vibrant, that can lead on these critical negotiations in many areas that will affect the African continent. So in a sense, there are, the Trump election could not have come at a bad time, at a time where we need to go one step up, both in the reform of the African Union and others, to be able to take the revamp of the regional commissions in such a way they take more proactive action. So again, now the timing could not have been as bad. Another, term of a democratic administration would have given us much more time. I think we got too contented with the good commodity prices, but the party is over right now. In many cases, those are opportune moments where we could have been able to sort of anchor significant changes that could lead to a more structural transformation in the future.
That takes us back to where you started. You said that there is a downturn now, economic and political downturn.
Political downturn.
Now, your personal view, how bad economically is it a short term? Or is this a long-term?
For me, it's a long-term, because much of the initial boom came from the commodity boom, from oil and others. Some countries were able to use that windfall profit into direct investment with regard to energy, railroad system, dams, and others. Those countries who did that are more likely to sustain their growth. For many others, they never invested it, So there was an opportune moment for some time where commodity prices, was very good, fetching good prices. The reinvestment part did not take very well. What you actually saw was, despite higher level of GDP growth, was also an enormous gap, enormous inequalities that has emerged. So there will be selected countries that are more likely to continue to do so, that have done good investment. The Rwandas, the Ethiopians, until the governance problem right now, and a few other countries that have done very well. But in general, I think the opportunity has been lost not to have been able to strategically invest natural resource revenue toward much more, in science and technology, in investment in infrastructure, rail network, energy sector, etc. That opportunities have been lost. The countries that have done that are more likely going to take advantage for the foreseeable future.
So raw material prices are not going up for some time?
They are not going to go up for some time.
Because of?
There have been there have been a reduced demand in China as they move up more high technology production issues. There have been quite a changes taking place, so they're unlikely, we'll never be able to see the prices we've seen 6 years ago for raw materials. It's just unlikely to happen. That we have reached really a glut level, a level in which, oil prices right now, I don't know, what, $50 or $60 right now. So the likelihood of that happening would be very, very difficult in the short-term period of time. So again, I think for some countries they are more likely to do okay, a limited number of countries, but many others are really will not be able to enjoy the kind of return back to 6-7 years ago as we have seen it in general.
Okay, I want to turn back now. You talk a lot about the United States, so a little more about Europe and Africa. I mean, it is a very important period now for African-European relations, because the Cotonou Agreement, which has sort of regulated EU-Africa relations, is coming to a close in a few years' time. And these negotiations were started, and then now suddenly one of the major sort of one of the major countries is leaving. So I mean, how do you, without sort of, can you speculate on what is going to happen in the European-African relationship?
I think first it will be within Europe itself. I'm not quite sure in terms of the coherence of the EU itself as an entity, the European project to begin with. So you need to have that survive before you can get into a more coherent engagement issue. So I think we are now into the unknown. Leave aside, the exit of the British, which is very important, but even the survival of the EU itself. I have some questions. The jury is out.
And what does it mean for Africa?
For Africa, basically, what you'll engage in a more mercantilist bilateral relationship. Individual countries, the French or the Dutch, doing on individual level, rather than a more combined, a more coherent approach to policies and strategies. So that would basically exhaust really dealing with 26 countries or even 20 countries even. So you will not have coherent approach on trade policy, on human rights issues, on environment issues, in as much as there has been discrepancies between EU-African relationship, but it did deliver something. It was important, it was there, it was not perfect, there were certainly inequalities, but so what form, are we going to get into a more bilateral approach, each country for its own, remains to be seen. But the question is, will would we see the survival of the EU itself? Is the EU going to be limited only to the original, to the founding countries? The Germans, the French, and the Dutch. So it'd be very interesting to see. I worry about the future directions of Europe as a political project itself, the European Union as a political project itself. That certainly is going to define on this EU-Africa relationship in general.
So you see a stronger East Asia, and they're taking opportunity while Europe cannot take the opportunity in the relation with Africa. And
definitely, I'm not saying that there is a coherent East Asian policy either, because still, the approach, the Chinese would certainly be in the lead. As I say, they are there for a long period of time. The very fact now they also have the development bank, the contingency reserve fund that they created with China funding, so they have a financing mechanism right now, the Asians, under the leadership, of course, of China, and with rotating presidency. So the BRICS Development Bank, the Contingency Reserve Fund, and new other mechanisms become a way. They don't need the World Bank, they don't need anybody in many ways, although many other Western countries have joined some of those banks right now as non-voting members. So you have an alternative mechanism being created. The dollar may survive, but the RMB is right now becoming increasingly a reserve currency. You can exchange. It's being exchanged by countries. An Ethiopian birr for a Chinese RMB. So there is a formation of more stronger, solid institutional capacity, of course, under the leadership of China. That is emerging. So they do have the financing mechanism increasingly. It has not been very open. The first loan has gone to South Africa for an energy financing, $188 million. But they have enough, each of the countries contribute up to $50 billion initially, paid up capital, but it already have $500 billion as starting capital. That's more likely going to grow.
Okay, I have one more question
Sure.
before I open the floor.
Please.
With the figures you gave from the new budget, there will be even cuts when it comes to World Bank and others. So the question is really, if the with the new BRICS Bank, perhaps there is no competition because there will be no World Bank. The United States stands for around 20% of the funding also for the World Bank. And I think it's very important why Fantu has put so much emphasis on the American budget is that even if the aid fund, for example, from the United States is only 0.1 or 0. Of the GNP, it's still in absolute terms very big. So it means for refugees, as you said, it's 1.5
billion
out of
4 billion.
Out of 4 billion. So it's also it's more than 30%.
Peacekeeping operations.
And that will be a disaster for UNHCR and other. And the UN system already is under such a pressure that a number of UN agencies are closely to close down.
So this is a real challenge that we will face.
Will the World Bank survive?
The World Bank, of course, you always have American president, but they will use the World Bank resources to promote American interest. In many ways possible. World Bank funding tied into XYZ situation. So there will be definitely quite a cut. In terms of volume, in terms of percentage is nothing, but in terms of volume, it makes up quite a large percentage of the assistance that are provided. And of course, there are also other money which is off-budget money that you don't see it in the budget that goes on through the Pentagon and others, other agencies. But I think it's going to be whatever money put is the end result is make America great. If you can't show that you're making America great, then it's irrelevant to do it. So there will be a more aggressive approach. I think the thing that scares me the most. It's not because of conservative versus liberal issues. Never have I seen in my years living in the United States an administration that has come. You need to go back to the elections. This is a person who got the presidency without the support of the Republican establishment. So basically, so he became president without having the backings of the Republican establishment. So consequently, by the time once the primary is over, normally any administration, when they're preparing, they will reach out to think tanks, etc., to help them. They have not set up anything. They have not even reached out to the Heritage Foundation, to the Hoover Institute, to conservative. They really don't know. There are 4,000 White House staffers that have to be replaced, just within the White House alone. Where are you going to get all these people? So I do worry. I think the impact will be more lingering, not just on Africa, in general, because they have not really tapped in the knowledge and capacities that exist there, because they run basically a very different campaign that is completely delinked from the rest of the establishment. Consequently, they have not been able to tap in existing knowledge and institutions of more conservative institutions in the United States. So I think there's going to be a long struggle unless they do some serious damage. I don't see the possibilities of impeachment. That's not going to happen. But in the meantime, the dangers of a war is there. I cannot rule out where. It's impossible to say. So the idea of a potential war somewhere is likely to happen at some point. So I'm much more cynical about it. It's because you're not disagreeing them on the basis of ideology. These people are just they run their own shop. They are not linked to the mainstream of even conservative America in terms of to be able to tap in. There's a lot of African experts who are Republicans. Nobody is touching them. They are not too conservative for them. And then the composition of the National Security Council with people like Steve Bannon at the core of it, the reorganization, the marginalization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Defense. It is a scary scenario we are in. They live in a very completely different bubble and a different situation. So we will see mistakes, we'll see irrational decision making that will happen, because their understanding of the world is just so narrow. It's not ideology anymore. It's just narrow, totally isolated world.
With these optimistic words,
back again. We never conclude optimistically.
The floor is open for questions or comments, or you're sprittling with it. Yes? No? They are so taken back with what you have said.
You have to ask them what does it mean for Sweden.
Huh?
What does it mean for Sweden? How does Sweden deal with this nuts?
No, we are talking about Africa now.
Yeah.
There is a saying that the hand that gives is the hand that rules. Why is Africa always looking for aid in this case? Why can't it rule itself?
Yeah, I was with a colleagues today on a telephone. If you look into the current drought situation right now, Somalia is very different. Okay, South Sudan, those guys should be sent to the ICC. This is man-made, you know that. But one area that absolutely amazed me, with a country that have huge resources, it is going through major economic crisis, but there are over 100 million Nigerians. I'm very surprised Nigeria is in that list, that is not able to respond to a particular region of Nigeria, a country that is really smartest people, got all sorts of stuff. It takes time. We have 2 droughts in the last 2 years in Ethiopia. This last drought, the last drought, what 50 million people affected last year. Not one person died. It's not in the current list. There's still partly drought, massive refugees from Somali side, South Sudan side. It comes down to the questions of what kind of leadership, what kind of governance you have at the end of the day. And you're right, there are people say, it's okay if there's no aid anymore. But the reality is there are areas where aid can play an important role. But it has gone too long, you're right. But it's really where aid is insignificant to, if you look into diaspora remittances relative to foreign aid, it's massive. The question is, how do you deploy, how do you mobilize your own people for a common purpose? It comes down to the governance issue. So it's really come down to political issues.
So if there are problems there, should I use it or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if there are political problems, then if the Trump administration asks how much of the aid money is going into corruption, then is it not a valid question?
From an American taxpayer's point of view, yes. In my own interaction, to Swedish politicians here, Sweden has been a very important support, one of the countries that support the UN. And I've had open discussion where I say, you shouldn't do that. You should do to the UN, but to this and this and this. As a taxpayer, because I see it as a Swedish taxpayer from the other side now too, where resources can be put. To tell you the truth, I would not give a dime to any regional economic commissions. I wouldn't give a dime to UNIDO. What is UNIDO going to do about industrialization? It's a private sector. So there's a lot of issues. So there are valid issues, but in the meantime, I think there is an exaggeration in the United States that the entire world lives off the American dole, when reality is it's not even 1% of the total budget that goes on. So there's an exaggerating. Everybody lives off us, which is not really true, relative to that. Yeah, this is a time to have this discussion internally and externally, definitely. But there are areas where programs where you make significant lives. With the work we did, for example, with the Ebola crisis, that was worth every dime of it. The work on HIV/AIDS is worth it. So again, of course, we have to be selective where it can make real, direct differences in people's lives.
But you are right. Perhaps we shouldn't exaggerate aid.
No.
Because what the United States is doing is much more. They are also sort of limiting the ability for African countries to export themselves out of poverty. So if they start a protection wave, which will take on. If the United States does it, then it's also possible for other parts of the world, as you can see.
But that would be sanctions if they limit African countries from exporting.
They start by, both Europe and United States. It's very criticized, but still there are trade
restrictions.
No, they are trade favorization for Africa. So Africa has a possibility. AGOA, even with all its criticism, if you take that away, it limits trade. But also the United States' own sort of protectionism. If you, for example, if EU would break the Cotonou Agreement, this would mean that the favorable trade arrangements, which are criticized and rightly so, but still they are favorable trade, would suddenly disappear. each European country cannot start with each African countries to start to negotiate special trade agreements. So there will be no. I mean, it will be a clear limitation for Africa. So it's not only. I mean, it's not aid, and it's not. I mean, it's the whole package. And the most sort of the sad thing is that U.S., in spite of its limited willingness to donate funds or support, they are still have been so big as and in absolute terms that they are. So I mean, even important agencies which have nothing to do with aid, like refugee, like UNHCR, for example, helping refugees, I mean, will be halved or almost halved. And that at a time when everybody else is cutting down their aid and support. Now more questions.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I have 2 or 3 questions. First I was wondering, what do you think is more the short-term and medium impact of you were highlighting in the beginning that now US funding is going down to the UN organizations, and that will have like strong impact on their budgets. What do you think will happen? Will this then force the UN organizations to maybe look more on what are their comparative advantages? Could that be kind of they have to show why they are relevant, since then they can just they have to kind of fight for? Can that be maybe a positive thing, or will it then be risk of more duplication and more of them going to the same donors and looking for funding? So what do you think? Could there be some positive, or what are the risks? And then I was also thinking about the other question about other financial flows to Africa, as you rightly said, aid is just one out of other flows. How do you see of Africa, and what are the prospects of attracting more of these new flows? I'm thinking about the financing for development at this huge Addis conference that took place 2 years ago, and they talked about turning billions to trillions and attracting pension funds in big investments. What do you see is happening there when it comes to investment? And then a related question is, what do you think about that? It was predicted now since a few years that as the manufacturing from China will move to Africa. Is that happening? Can Africa compete with its cheap labor and production? Yeah. Thank you.
Let me address the first one first. With regard to, does this threat of the cut to the UN, would that instigate real reform that they will go into comparative advantage? Believe me, I'm a UN man. I have been to many UN reform processes. I'm exhausted by it, and it will certainly create. I remember, for example, 2 days ago, the new Secretary General initiated a whole new initiative because of the massive criticism they received on peacekeeping operations and the abuse of women and all that stuff. So they're trying to get down to the bottom of it. But the UN is itself, it's much easier to pull together warlords and sign a peace agreement than to get UN agencies to come together and agree on. It's a very different animal. And for me, I think the UN has done a major contribution since 1945. Okay? We're in a different era. The UN still need a UN. And I will really cut the UN down to 3 areas. The Secretariat, because that's the only platform to talk about global issues. It has convening power. I will fund that. I will do humanitarian assistance, the UN refugee agencies, and climate change, and that's it. Because we are now in 2016, not 1945. The world has changed. Technology has changed. Part of it is the UN success countries' capacities has also been built, not as much as we wanted to. So there are many players right now that can play in global issues. So would we see a major slimming down the UN system and identify comparative advantage of the UN in which areas that it can use convening power? So this is badly needed, because I'm sorry, because I've been so disappointed with so many UN reforms over the last 10 years alone. And we are not getting down, we just go around the circle and circle. So it's time that would happen. But again, I think climate change, very important area. Humanitarian assistance, peacekeeping, global public health issues. These are really important issues. We should focus, the rest, kill them. Really, I mean, so many UN agencies, I can tell you that I've worked. So there's there. So there is, the impetus will come from there. Well, I have been there before. I'm not sure whether this one is the greatest threat, because I also lived through the Reagan administration. When Ronald Reagan came in, really went after the UN. The US pulled out of UNESCO, pulled out a lot of resources, but it didn't go that far. So, be very interesting to see where we are heading in that direction. So, the second is on this, whether countries should be able to tap into new flows. How you tap into financial flows from other sources, in this case, whether it's pension fund, whether it's private sources, is very much conditioned by the kind of macro environment you have at home, macroeconomic policy environment, the environment for enabling infrastructure sector, power, energy, etc. So so we have to think about how do markets operate, what does markets need, do we have the enabling conditions in place for financial flow to come in. But of course you have to be very careful in terms of financial flow, Nobody wants to invest in long-term investment where cash is tied in. We live in a casino economy, speculation. You make big bucks. You lend $1 billion for 2 minutes, and you make $500 million in profit. So the nature of how global finance operates is very, very different. It doesn't look into the long term. So they are there, but it's not low-lying fruits to be picked. You need to work hard on it. You need to set conditions there. You need to have the technology, the investment, the information flows sector have to be there. Not the kind of antiquated, 1940 banking systems. You go back, most banking systems in Africa. But again, the technology is helping that. So it's not that easy. You need to have different conditions set in place for investors to be able to tap in on financial flows. There have been some countries that have been very successful in doing that, raising bonds in the London market and others. So, yes, they are there, but they are not easily. And we are not even good at tapping diaspora money, because we don't have a diaspora policy. One of the things I can say about 2-3 countries, including my own, I am both a US and Swedish citizen, but I have an Ethiopian green card now. Because they think, every Ethiopian is a cash machine. We don't want your politics, but we want your cash. It allows me visa-free travel, access to land. There are different incentives to get diasporas to invest. So if you don't have those policies, how many countries have those kind of policies in Africa that allows the diaspora, giving them priority in profit, and in incentives, in land, etc., to allow you to do so? We are not even using that. Let alone the financial market, which is complex sector to do. So yes, you cannot, but you gotta have smart governments, people who understand the market, understand where money is and how to get it. The third, the China factor. What was that question? The third question.
Yeah, if you think Chinese manufacturing as
yes, the same answer I can give you. For example, I work very closely with the government in Ethiopia until the state of emergency in October. There's been one country that has been very successful in not only Chinese manufacturing. They are setting themselves to become the manufacturing hub for East Africa, mostly on leather, textile, and carnation flower, lots of Dutch companies, and cement. So what do you have? In the last 10 years, they have built 5 major dams. The last dam, which is basically going to be the largest dam in Africa, with 4,000 whatever megawatt generation, currently about 57% completed, purely built with local money. Not a single foreign money there. And how do they build with local money? Every citizen have to buy a bond from the state. And they have been able, so one way is how you generate internal saving. So the idea is, this is a country that is investing a lot on solar energy and wind energy and hydropower and massive number of railroad systems. So because of that, the Chinese are coming in large numbers. There are 6 industrial parks they have created. The idea is to create 200,000 jobs every year, manufacturing jobs every year. For the next 10 years, they will spend $10 billion for the next 10 years. So the countries that have prepared themselves in doing that are likely to get those investments. So again, yes, they are coming. Chinese investment is coming because of high labor cost in China. So they're going to low labor cost, but the countries have to have logistic. They have to overcome the logistic challenge of rail, electricity, telecommunication, and human capital development. So what the government did the last 10 years have been to completely switch the country's education system upside down. 25% humanities and social science, 75% science and technology. So if you have done that, in a sense, you are preparing themselves. The pay is more likely going to be down the line. If you do that, they would certainly be able to attract. So getting textile and other industries from Bangladesh, from Malaysia, from China. So if you do that, but there are very few countries that have done that.
And then if you don't have a security situation that functions?
Well, then that's the problem. I mean, the collapse of the governance structure the last 9 months has definitely affected the mobilities of capital into the country. So peace and security is also as important as railroad system, as important of dams and bridges. So the question, how do you get the economy and the governance together right? And they are paying a very high price for it right now because of the nature in which the state dealt with into the expropriation of land from peasants without consultation, all sorts of other issues that come into it. So the possibilities are there because I think China is really moving very fast from low technology to high technology production. And so the logistic challenge is very important. And I can tell you, for example, there are 9 flights a day from Ethiopia, from Addis Ababa to China. 9 flights a day to Guangzhou, to Peking, to Shanghai. There are about 6 flights a day, every day, to New Delhi and Mumbai. Of course, they can transport so much, so they have the largest airlines in the continent. So the very fact they can move goods and people makes it much more competitive for them to be able to attract products. They have 15 Dutch companies growing carnation flowers. I don't know how many flights a day to Copenhagen, to Amsterdam with fresh flowers for delivery to the European market. So logistics is very important. So the countries that have invested that are more likely to do very well and compete better. And of course, and they should not, even after you do that, you should not sit on the couch and enjoy life. You need to always constantly upgrade, invest in innovation and technology and more in many areas. So the idea is right now they're exporting, the whole idea is to become the major export of energy to East Africa. Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya already buy energy. So all those 3, rail, road, air transport, energy, and human capital development, you have them there, then you are in a position to be able to attract those manufacturing sectors.
Okay, one more question. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, regarding back to what you just said on the example of Ethiopia, and that it has potential for the economic benefit then from like Chinese investment. So, I mean, that was really much more like exactly on the economic values. But I mean, as we all know, what comes with that, like especially like in the textile industry, a lot of, I mean, how the labor conditions are and environmental issues. And do you think there's governmental awareness and the potential to mitigate, like,
Well, in fact, this is one country, and this is the second growth transformation plan is a green economy model, rhetorically. In practice, is very different. There are two young Swedish ladies in Addis, who do procurement for H&M. They have been very influential dealing with this textile industry, which they procure from, to look about issues of labor rights, questions of environment, sustainability issue. I'm not sure it is, they are doing it in the selected, where they procure. But generally, I doubt it, because there was a report very recently released in one region where the carnation flower is grown by the Dutch factories. And one of the biggest lake there is completely polluted right now. For the last month, the population has been buying water from tanker trucks because these environmental provisions have not been. What happened? So rhetorically, it is a country with a green economy model, carbon-free by 2025, okay? And getting a lot of money for it from the global fund on it. But in practice, at the level of the factory level, except one new industrial zone in the south, which is well planned, in the majority of factories, particularly in the Chinese factories. If you go to some of the Chinese factories in Addis, you feel like you are in Guangzhou. From the training to the culture and to the salute, and God knows, I mean, it's real, reproduction of China. How much environmental labor rights issues is going on? I have some serious doubts. Rhetorically, the government embraces it. In practice, I'm not quite sure they are widely inspected and practiced and enforced as much as possible.
I mean, all these questions, I think almost every question falls back on the governance issue in the country itself. I mean, if a country prepares itself for doing certain things, then they can get very much positive out of aid, trade, multinational companies, be it from China, be it from the United States. If they are doing badly, I mean, then the results will be and this is also true when it comes to supervising environmental issues and so on. So I mean, the question of sort of ownership and real ownership is extremely important. Now we have room for one more question. So yes.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation and discussion. My question is regarding the sub-regional organizations in Africa, like ECOWAS in West Africa, for instance. We saw their role in January in Gambia. So what do you think their role will be in the next 1 or 2 years?
There's a lot of work and debate going on revamping, because they're supposed to be the founding blocks for an African economic integration. These so-called regional economic organizations are supposed to be the foundations. Progress has been different from, ECOWAS has been demonstrably very successful in peacekeeping related issues. Their engagement in Sierra Leone, if you remember, early on, the current engagement in Gambia, Liberia has been really successful on that part. But if you go into, they've been very good in the free movement of people, the ECOWAS passport. But on the nitty-gritty of integrations on currency, macroeconomic policy, regularizations of customs, all those issues, you know, when you are, some countries are committed or have done so much, others are at the beginning. So there are quite discrepancies. The one that has really done very well now has been the East African community, but they're also small, relative. You know, they died, they resurrected, and they have been much more effective. So all of them are at different levels that have been attempt to do, and you know, so the track record, you know, we need to get that right. But regional economic community integration, you know, the foundation for that has to be first national integration. How do you, you know, the dichotomy between urban and rural, the dichotomy in policy at the national level, let alone among member states. The question of harmonization of policy, coordination of policies, and a number of issues remain. So there are, each of them have some success in one item, not in all of it. And again, I think that the idea would be to really revamp and create. If we can just create two good examples that others can follow, others can lead, would be a very interesting area. At some point, SADC was supposed to be the future, but you know, you got the big elephant, South Africa, in the room, and then that creates a major discrepancies. And then there's the political issues, you know, political governance issues that comes in. But again, all of them have some things they have done, but you know, we've been talking about this since 1962, so we need to be up in speed to get it done. But certainly, I think ECOWAS particularly has been very good on matters of politics at the regional level. And when you go about ECOWAS, of course, you're talking about Nigeria. It always requires Nigerian leadership, you know. And in that sense, the Nigerians have been critical in these areas, actually.
Thank you very much, Fantu.
Thank you.
Europe is not so much better example. So as you said yourself. Thank you very much. I think you have got a lot of present, both problems and challenges for Africa from the rest of the world. I hope when we meet, say in a half a year's time, that things looks much more positive and more optimistic. I hope that your sort of fears will not come true. I'm not sure, but I hope, and we all hope, because it's our own, it's not only Africa's future, it's all our future. So thank you very much for coming, and we will follow up this up perhaps with also looking at other continents and how they are affected by sort of all developments that are taking place. I mean, it's not only sort of what is happening in the United States and Brexit, it's also challenges for climate and challenges for so many other dimensions. And of course, this affects us all. And it's interesting to zoom into continents that we usually don't discuss. So you are welcome back again to FUF. Thank you very much, all of you, and thank you. Thank you. Thank you.